In today's story, we hear of that most terrifying thing, an opportunistic murder by a total stranger with a long list of convictions unknown to us for violence and living among us. 34-year-old mum of three, Michelle Gunshon, lived in London with her partner Ian. She'd worked in the security business for a number of years, and she travelled north to Birmingham on the 3rd of December 2004 for a closed show live event at the NEC with two colleagues, Richard Finney and Michael Keegan. The three had booked accommodation, but due to a flood at the property, they ended up staying somewhere else, the Dubliner. It was a lively pub in Digbeth, close to the city centre. They offered rooms in the form of three self-contained flats with two bedrooms and a shared bathroom. Michelle took one room in one of the flats, and her two colleagues shared a room in another of the flats. After working all day, they retired to the bar for a drink, but Richard's wife called to say that where Michelle had left her car outside Richard's house so they could drive up together had annoyed a local resident who had, you've guessed it, left a nasty note on the window. Yep, we all know that sort of person, right? Michelle agreed with Richard that to be on the safe side, she would drive back in his car, leave it at his home, and then return in her car. All went to plan, and she got back in the early hours and went straight to bed. It was an early start the next day at the show. She drove her colleagues to the venue the next day, and on arriving back at the pub, she secured a spot close to the pub. Whilst her two colleagues headed to the lively bar for some more drinks, Michelle was a little weary from the night before and said that she might just get an early night. About an hour later, though, Richard was out of cash, so he headed up to Michelle's room to see if she would lend him some. The room was unlocked, and inside, Michelle was just taking it easy watching some TV before calling her daughter Tracy. The pair were super close, and they spoke numerous times a day. Her daughter later recalled this conversation. "I rang my mum. She seemed tired," she said. "She was at the Dubliner pub. We were talking about Christmas because I wanted a pair of shoes for work, and I said, 'Mum, if you can get it, that would be great.' She said she would see what she could do. I asked if she was tired, and she said she was. I said, 'I'll let you go, and I'll speak to you tomorrow.'" Michelle then called her partner Ian before turning in for the night. Meanwhile, her two colleagues were going large in the bar, where the beer was flowing and so was the conversation. The next day, they slept through their alarms, and they popped up to Michelle's room to see if she'd waited for them to take them to the show. The door was unlocked, but there was no sign of Michelle. Richard and Michael couldn't see Michelle's car outside the pub, so they just assumed she'd left for work without them, so they jumped in a cab to the NEC. But Michelle hadn't gone to work, and there was no answer on her phone. Her family hadn't heard from her, and her car wasn't there. At 3 p.m., Richard and Michael checked Michelle's room again, and they saw Michelle's belongings, along with her mobile phone, were in her room, and there were 27 missed calls on her mobile phone, and the last number dialed was her partner's the night before. Michael and Richard spoke to the owner of the Dubliner about the mystery of where Michelle could be, and he called down to the other man who'd been staying in the pub, 36-year-old Michael Stafford, who was an old friend of the landlord from growing up in Ireland. And at this time, he was down on his luck, and he earned his bed and beer by collecting glasses and doing other odd jobs around the pub. He said that he'd seen Michelle washing her jeans in the shared bathroom, but otherwise, he hadn't seen her the night before. The police were called, and detectives immediately felt that CCTV footage, there was lots of it in the area, could play a key role in the investigation about what had happened to Michelle. One piece in particular appeared to be significant, which was recorded just after 7 a.m. on the Sunday when Michelle disappeared. This showed Michelle and one other person getting into her car, and they were so close together, it looked as though Michelle was being forced by the other figure to get in the car. This vehicle was then caught by a speed camera at 8:20 a.m., being driven by a man with Michelle in the passenger seat. It was flashed again at 9:08 a.m., heading back towards the pub, but this time there was no sign of Michelle. And on the 7th of December, the car was found just a few streets from the Dubliner pub. Did this suggest that whoever had taken Michelle and the car needed to get back to this general area? The car was muddy, and it was also smeared with blood that matched Michelle's, and there was also semen found on the front seat when this was tested. So it seemed to be significant that sexual activity must have taken place on that seat. And when this was tested, it was a clear match to Martin Stafford, the other occupant of the pub apartments on the night that Michelle had disappeared. And Stafford was missing. He'd been missing from the Dubliner since the Sunday, the 5th of December. But when the CCTV images of the car were shown to the owner of the pub, he confirmed that the images were in fact Stafford. Combined with the DNA match, he was clearly the prime suspect for taking and sexually assaulting Michelle. But was she still alive somewhere? The owner's brother had bumped into Stafford outside the pub in the early hours of the 6th of December and offered him a bed for the night, just assuming he'd fallen out of another customer. It was a common thing to happen. Stafford asked him not to mention that they'd been out, and over the time he spent at his flat, Stafford was drinking heavily. On one occasion, the two men spoke about the hills near Dublin and the rumours that they were full of dead bodies. During this conversation, Stafford said that if he ever committed murder, he would get rid of the body in the concrete foundations of some building or some road. Stafford made his way to Dublin on the ferry from Holyhead, and using false ID, he stayed in a railway hut on the edge of the city. Once there, he carried out a serious sexual assault on a sex worker he'd previously bought sex from. She told how she arrived at 7:30 p.m. and he locked the door from the inside and told her that she was getting no money from him, and that's when he seriously assaulted her and threatened her with a hammer and scissors. Stafford was again drinking heavily, and he passed out during the night, and that's when the woman called the police, and he was arrested at 5:30 a.m. Facing court for this offence, the court heard that Stafford had 23 previous convictions, including a 7-year sentence in 1997 for false imprisonment of a contract cleaner who he forced at knife point to perform a sex act. His lawyer in mitigation said he had suffered a terrible childhood with his mum and 3 siblings dying, and how he began abusing drugs in a big way when he was just 14. For this crime, Stafford was sentenced to 9 years in prison. Stafford was serving his sentence in Dublin when police officers in Birmingham tracked him down, but he couldn't be brought back to the UK, so they had to wait until he finished serving his time. But meanwhile, detectives learned of another incident involving Stafford just before Michelle was attacked. This time it was at a homeless hostel in London. It was about 2:30 a.m. when the male victim was trying to sleep when he heard banging on his door. He told the person banging he was trying to sleep and just to go away. But the banging continued, so he got up and answered the door, where he saw Stafford, who pushed into the room and shut the door behind him. He threatened the man, asking him to take off his gold ring and give it to him. He also pointed at a number of other things he wanted, including the TV. Stafford then pulled out a knife and told him again to give him what he wanted. Stafford then unzipped his trousers, urinated in a cup, and told the other man to perform a sex act on him. When he refused, Stafford lunged at him with the knife and he sustained a badly cut right hand. Luckily, members of staff heard the commotion and intervened. They heard Stafford say, "If you grasp me up for this, I'm going to kill you. I mean it." Despite his protests of innocence, Stafford was charged with unlawful wounding over this incident. In 2011, West Midlands police were finally able to bring Stafford back to Birmingham to face trial for the murder of Michelle Gunshon. The prosecution told how they believed Stafford raped and murdered Michelle. Even though no body had been found, they felt they had the evidence to secure a conviction. They'd CCTV, DNA, his past history of serious sexual assault, and he had access to Michelle's room. He actually had a key. Under cross-examination, He was a really sad figure, saying, "My mind is so shot with drink and drugs that I can't remember much." He explained that he was high on cocaine at the time and tried to explain his semen being on the passenger seat by saying he had used the car for consensual sex with somebody else. But more evidence pointed to his guilt. He had a kitchen knife in his room and he'd used it before, one time in a fight with another man who lived in the same block as him. It certainly seemed likely that this was the knife he'd used to threaten Michelle with. But what about Michelle's body? What had he done with her? At this time, the Bullring shopping centre in the centre of Birmingham was being redeveloped. As he had said in the drunken conversation shortly after Michelle's disappearance about leaving a body in concrete, had he done this with Michelle? Or had he buried Michelle somewhere? This could explain all the soil and foliage that was found in the car. Either way, Stafford wasn't admitting anything. The jury made their decision on the evidence in front of them, and they found him guilty of charges of murder, rape, false imprisonment, and preventing a proper burial. For this, he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term in jail of 33 years. Throughout the whole trial, Stafford showed no emotion at all. After the hearing, Michelle's distraught daughter, Tracy, contacted him many times asking for him to please let them give Michelle a proper burial and lay her to rest. She wrote one time, "After everything, you still have time to change, time to do the decent thing. For me, for my family, and for my mum. I need to know where she is. I need you to tell me. I want to lay flowers on her grave and say goodbye. Tell me where she is. That's all I ask of you." But even though Stafford was going to spend the rest of his life in prison, he wouldn't even do that. Let's forward wind to 2015 when Michelle's daughter Tracy was just living a normal day. She describes what happened next. "I was at home with some friends when a car pulled up outside. A woman knocked on the door and I realised it was my victim liaison officer. I asked her what was going on and she said that Stafford had died in prison. At first I was relieved, but within a minute I thought, and what about my mum?" Stafford, at just 47, had caused so much damage to his body through years of abusing alcohol and drugs. He died of pneumonia and liver disease in prison. Speaking in 2020, Tracy spoke about how the family still regularly returned to the spot where her mum was last seen to lay flowers. "I just want to keep her memory alive," said Tracy, "because even though it's years on, that bit of hope that someone may come across her is still alive. It's hard, especially around Christmas. I try and hide my emotions so my children aren't affected. She never liked the cold. She's out there somewhere, but no one knows where." There was one final side note to this story. In 2006, the Dubliner suffered an arson attack and the whole building was destroyed. Nobody was ever convicted. So there we have it. With Stafford dead, will Michelle's body ever be found so her devastated family can provide her with the burial that she needs and say their goodbyes? We can only hope so. Thank you so much for watching this episode. If you found it of interest, please do watch one of my others. Until next time, I've been Adam Lloyd.